Hi, I'm Matt from Loke Battlemats.
And I'm Tam, and thank you very much for joining us for this hour session where we are going to be talking about tabletop roleplay encounters. Specifically, we're going to be talking about map design and some top DM tips to help encounters run smoothly with less time investment from DMs, and some top tips to make things a little less repetitive than they can be. Now, you may know us as publishers and designers of RPG map books. We have quite a few out on the market now. If you go and check out our website, www.lokebattlemats.com, you can see everything we do. Matt is our head designer. He designs all the maps in our books, and he's also been a DM for over 30 years now. So we wanted to share some of that experience with you and really show you how we do things here in terms of designing our maps and also in the games that we run at home. Right, so Matt, obviously, in terms of encounters in tabletop role-playing, there are several different kinds that you as a DM might find you're planning in. Could you give us a bit of a definition of what the general encounters you'll find are?
Yeah, so I mean, as we're looking at setting up drawing or setting encounters on battle maps, we're going to be talking about challenges or tactical encounters.
Right, okay. And in terms of planning them into your campaign, obviously some will be more anticipated than others, as it were.
Oh, for sure. So set pieces and your planned dungeons, your planned heists, your planned scenes are all well and good, but as your players often will, they will go off track and you'll need random encounters and to quickly work out a scene you maybe weren't quite prepared for.
Yes, as we work through this section, what we will do is we will break down several of those different sorts of encounters to demonstrate some of the points that we're just going to run through first. So we're going to do a random encounter and a few of the larger planned set pieces. We're going to be using some additional scenery as well, but we'll make sure that you know where you can get hold of all this stuff from if you'd like to copy what we're doing. So Matt, obviously when you're starting drawing a map, we always start with a blank page. So if you as a DM, you want to draw a map for your encounter, but you don't know where to start, what would you recommend?
Visualize the encounter first, so know roughly what you're trying to end up with. Is it a forest scene? Is it a dungeon? Are they in a town? Or anywhere, because that's the joy of roleplay, is absolutely anything could in theory happen. So work out what the encounter is going to be. So if it's just been randomly generated, you should have some sort of clue from the tables you've generated it from, or whatever has sprung into your mind for that new made up scene. Consider who the participants of the encounter are going to be. So you're going to be using a battle map because you need to either track tactical combat or track some sort of other challenge. So that could be things like skill challenges, crossing a rapid river, trying to jump stepping stones, climbing up the side of some cliffs or something maybe. Chase scenes is another classic sort of challenge type map where you not necessarily do the same tactical scale, but you'd want something to represent and track what's happening. So knowing what the encounter is going to be is your first step, otherwise you don't know what you're trying to draw. And start simple. Just put the largest elements in as simple geometric shapes. So just a couple of squares, a couple of circles to work out where things are, and then make sure that that's going to work for the characters and participants in the scene. So, a good example, you've got a random encounter and it needs something that's huge. So, in D&D terms, you're looking at a 3x3 base. Make sure it can move around. If it's stuck in one part of the map, it's just going to get picked off by your characters at distance. Unless, of course, it's got distance attacks, and that's part of the plan, but that's how you go.
Right, so once you've got your setting, you know what that setting is going to be used for, and you know in terms of the structure of it, what sizes it's going to have to accommodate. What would you move on to next?
Possibly know what the resolution for the encounter is going to be. Is it a fight? Is it something to make the PCs run away? Are they trying to get something? And then give them more than one option to get to that end result. If you can, use the map to help. So if it's a heist, so you're breaking into a bank vault or something, maybe give them some crawl spaces and things to get in, maybe a complex mechanical door that could be unlocked by sort of thief or rogue or intelligence-based characters, or maybe just fight through the guards, get their key and open it up. So, give some options for your party. And one of the things I think when designing an encounter is make sure that there's something for every person playing to be involved with. So, if your entire party are all combat happy, make it a combat. If you've got someone that wants to do some puzzle solving, maybe some people fight off the guards while someone else solves the puzzle lock. Just make sure that you've not got a player sat there with their character not able to do anything in a scene.
That does help keep everyone involved. So I know that one of the things we've encountered in our games as well is that the Leroy Jenkins moment, as we like to call it, where one character will get a little bit bored and maybe charging ahead of what would the party would plan to be a more planned encounter. And how would you handle that sort of scenario?
You've got to, I suppose, let that character that's maybe would bring more damage and harm to the party as a whole, let the party try and deal with it first, so in character and out of character. So you kind of say, look, we know you want to get into combat, but maybe don't go charging in and bring back every single monster, because it could, be a TPK, total party kill. You've ended the game for everyone, and the DM needs to make that a dream scene, or it's all new characters. But yeah, just making sure that there's in-game obvious hints. You can put as many signs as you like, someone may still go and do it, but there's lots of them. It looks like they can call for help. They outnumber you greatly. All the sort of little hints that sort of say, maybe don't charge in.
So, and also using your map and your plan to give them lots of different options as well. So there's always an alternative to the old charge and see what happens method. For
sure. And things like shadows and areas of light and dark are really going to help with that. If you want to help your characters visualize sneaking past an overwhelming set of enemies, for example. Tree trunk to tree trunk sort of thing, or pillars in a great hall. All those sort of things work quite nicely for giving you some tactical elements that aren't necessarily just combat based.
Yeah.
I suppose one of the other ones that's key is elevation and blocking and dangerous ground. It's nice to have some interaction with the environment in the encounter. So something I always try and do is, if I'm going to have an encounter, even if it's been randomly set up, is I'll want something to be interactive in that environment. Maybe you can trigger a landslide. Maybe that tree's a bit loose in its roots and might be able to be pushed over to block the enemy's path. That contraption over there, if dealt with, could release a cloud of poison gas that would change the encounter completely. But just have something that could be done. And I think that comes back again to making sure every player at the table can get their character engaged in a scene in some way. And if you've got someone who likes staying out of combat, maybe they're the person that goes around and, sneakily sets off the poison trap while the frontline fighters occupy the guards, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So definitely in those sort of scenarios, having something visual in front of you where you can run your party through exactly what is where and what the possibilities are is pretty crucial, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. D&D obviously is the most popular tabletop game for roleplay, and its roots are a war game. So, the movement rates are based on old wargaming table movement rates and things. And a lot of the rules, you need to know where you are, how far away you are from people, what area of effect you've got to cover if you've got spells and things. The classic's always did you just fireball yourself? Well, we're not quite sure. It's easy to tell on the map. Things like attacks of opportunity, are you getting an advantage because you've got one of your friendly combatants next to an enemy? All of those sort of things is a lot harder to visualize without a map. And I think part of the problem for trying to do tactical combat like that, theatre of the mind, is everyone's view in the theatre of mind slightly different. So, the DM may think everyone's out of range of a certain spell. The caster may think they are in range. They cast away just to only find out that, right, no one is affected by your spell. Okay, well, I thought I would get them. No, you don't. So for tactical combat, maps are great.
Yeah.
And you can do combat without them, but the more participants become involved, and if your system's tactically inclined like D&D is, maps help.
Yeah. It's also worth, of course, covering that a lot of people at the moment are playing online on platforms such as Roll20. Other platforms are obviously available. And obviously the involvement of a map digitally is just as important as it is physically.
Oh, totally. And you get more tools to play with, I suppose, more easily. It's very easy to build a very big miniature collection online compared to doing so in the real world. And painting's a lot easier because they're already coloured in.
Yeah, yes. We won't mention unpainted miniatures. That's a whole section by itself. But yes, it is also worth, hopefully you'll be able to apply some of these tips as easily to designing online maps as physical ones. Obviously, the example we have here is a plain grid and a trusty whiteboard marker. And that, as simply as, is all you need to create an encounter map. But obviously working online, for our maps, we use, Matt uses Photoshop to design the maps, which obviously are digital and which we then print out into a hard format. So Matt, do you have any tips for anybody who wants to start using a program like Photoshop but isn't really sure how to get started?
Yeah, I mean, I use Photoshop as my tool of choice just because I've got the most experience using that. I know there are free versions available as well, things like GIMP. But yeah, I think the top tip is layers, number one. You can draw lots of different things on different layers, keep them separate, manipulate them individually. So like a layer for the base floor, a layer for streams or other outdoor elements, layers for walls, layers for trees. And it just means that if something's not quite in the right place, you can move just that element in that layer. And it helps with reusing as well. So I suppose another top tip when doing digital battle maps is assets. So essentially anything which could be used again in another map, take your time to do that as a separate piece, then put it on your map, then save it so that you can use it again in another map. So things like, trees, sections of floor, doors, things that you'll use over and over again.
Excellent. If you want to find out more about how to design in Photoshop, then Matt is doing some live drawing streams up on our Twitch channel, and we have some live map drawing as well, which we've done. And obviously reach out to us. We're more than happy to share tips on what we do. In terms of being a DM online as opposed to in person, what are the main differences you've found?
Obviously the main difference is not being able to see people and read their, emotions effectively. It's a lot more difficult communicating on voice or video channels. For my own game, we tend not to use video channels, and that's mainly bandwidth related.
Yes.
When we turn all the videos on, it grinds to a halt.
Yeah.
And some people have problems and have to drop out. So we do everything on voice. I tend to use Discord for voice. It's a very nice dedicated voice platform. And
other platforms are available.
But the ability to have more than one voice chat room is useful. So you can have a private room to have individual conversations with players. You've got the ability to message people individually as well on whichever platform you're using. You'll be able to whisper comment.
So you can digitally slip them a note.
And they can do the same back to you. And they've got to make sure they get their whisper right, otherwise they accidentally send to the whole channel, I'm going to pickpocket that person's character. And, lol, joking. The one thing I found I've had to do quite a lot is take almost like an initiative turn, but use it for just general conversation pieces. It's easy to forget someone's there if they're not talking. So the best thing to do is you'll normally have a list somewhere of who's in the game. Every so often, just run through it and, player A, how are you doing? What are you doing in this scene? What's your character up to? Player B, same questions. And just run through, make sure everyone has to answer, basically.
Yeah.
So I suppose it's a bit like being a teacher or something. You have got to make sure people are paying attention. And you've got to bring them in if someone might be more vocal and be talking a lot more. You just need to every so often sort of say, great, let's see what everyone else is doing, and just try and make sure your players are interacting. It's easy to sort of go offline and maybe still be in the game, but also playing a different game on your computer, watching the TV or something.
Or equally, you could have someone who's sat there wanting to get involved, but not feeling they have that opportunity, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a lot harder to tell without being able to see people. Because if someone's getting a bit bored with an encounter or scene at a table, you can usually tell because their phone will be coming out and they'll be having a sort of like a scroll around and not really paying attention, and you'll be able to see that at a table and go, right, okay, their character, they're not engaged, which means there's probably nothing for their character to do, or something's happening that they're not as interested in. Bring them in, or get one of the other players to bring them in is easy sort of thing, so that they get some involvement again. But yeah, just every so often, round table is the main trick that I've found for online play.
And lastly, before we move on to look at some specific scenarios, I have to ask, do you roll a physical dice?
For online, no.
Could you if you wanted to?
Absolutely. I've seen setups where people do have a webcam set up, and it's just set up looking at a dice tray, just because they want that clack of, proper little math rocks rolling. And yeah, I get it. Although one of my main online games at the minute has a big dice pool system with lots of re-rolls, and there's nice little interaction for that on the online platform. So you can just click a button and it'll re-roll 10 dice in the appropriate way for you.
So there is an ease of use issue there. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think there's a lot more of that for the more established games. So D&D's got lots of different macros and things. So if you get your game set up right, you can sort of go, oh, I've got such and such a monster. Great. I'll add that token to the scene, and you'll get options you can click on. Sort of go, well, what's it going to do now? It's going to do this action. It'll roll that attack for you.
Fantastic. Right. Well, I think without further ado, what we are going to do is set up some specific encounter scenarios and then talk you through some specific maps in terms of what tips we have to draw them, what tips we have to play through them, and what your encounters might look like.
Fantastic.
Right, let's go. Right, so the first type of encounter map we're going to be looking at is your classic urban tavern encounter map. Now, while I wouldn't describe this obviously as being a random encounter, because of course your adventuring party is going to need to visit town quite a few times throughout any campaign, I would say that obviously one of the challenges for a DM is that once they get to town, they've got quite a few different options of things they will obviously want to do and things that you can get them to do. So Matt, in an urban town such as this map in front of us, what are the main options for an adventuring party?
So I think first up, an adventuring party is going to go back to town classically to resupply, rest and heal up, spend their loot, as well as, turn some of the more esoteric items into coin, that sort of thing, and then spend that coin. So shopping for new gear and the inevitable trip to a tavern, which, is partly to get accommodation and celebrate said adventures.
Right. So as you can see, what we have set out in front of us is that ever essential tavern map. So Matt, can you run us through this map and take us through some of the main features of what you've drawn here?
Yep, so just looking at the map itself, we've got a nice big central tavern hall with some furniture pre-drawn onto the map. So this one's got a bar with some stools and a set of tables and just some rugs to break the patterns and things going through the middle and to give sort of distinct areas. We've got the outside of the street, so you've got like a nice choke point for going in and out. So if someone's restricting who's going into the tavern or whatever,
so you position your bouncers around here.
Yes, exactly. And we've got some back rooms, and then the ever useful small alleyway linking onto street with a couple of buildings. So encounter wise, you've got a party coming back to town. They've got loot. There are going to be people in that town who are going to be interested in that loot. So you're likely to encounter the ne'er-do-wells of a town.
Maybe in this sort of area here around this dark alley. I think it's worth mentioning as a general map drawing tip that if you are going to have a lovely tavern like this, you absolutely must have a dark alley next to your tavern, and additionally some rooms which could also be seen as a cellar in this instance, just so that when you're having some of the more suspicious characters encountering your party and some interactions there, they can do that in an equally suspicious environment.
Absolutely. And you don't have to use it as a standard, party visit the tavern. This could be the target of a mission in an urban environment. So this could be a guild or a thieves' headquarters or a gang or some such. They may have something the players want, and they may have to find ways to get into or infiltrate and get information from that sort of place. So they're having the outside environment, which essentially it's akin to rooms and corridors in a dungeon, but it's outdoors and in a town. So you'd have your main room here where there'll be plenty of NPCs that you might need to chat to or avoid angering, or not necessarily tip them off that you're trying to find out or steal stuff from them. It's the sort of environment where you wouldn't necessarily expect to walk in fully armed and armoured without raising eyebrows. So maybe you want to have like your combat team hiding around the side somewhere, ready to burst through the back doors and come and surprise everyone from there. And again, if you're using that first sort of idea where people are trying to maybe pick up on some of the loot that the characters have recently gained from previous adventures, having one of these outdoor buildings here, possibly one of these is the latrine toilet block for the tavern.
The privy.
Yep.
An often underused encounter area, I find.
Yeah, we tend to not put them into every map. I think medieval technology and what it is, quite often buckets out of windows.
Lovely.
Is also the way. But thematically, you could try and ambush a character or two as they're off visiting another room, basically.
I mean, and in terms of the environmental factors of this map, because obviously you have this large indoor area here, which is nice. It's brightly lit. It's quite smartly furnished. So obviously it could be tavern, could be a guild hall, could be many different things. And obviously the things that would work for an encounter in this area would obviously be slightly different, being inside and well lit and quite presented. Whereas when you move to this area of the map, what you have is some darker areas. Obviously you're outside. So would you use environmental factors for encounters here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So definitely light and dark. So we're different ranges of vision, should I say, as opposed to just light and dark.
Yes.
And there's nothing to stop you having actual environmental effects. So you're like rain, high winds, all those sort of things, reasons to get in, cozy up inside the tavern.
I mean, at the moment, I'm playing a forest gnome rogue. So this dark alley here would be very much my environment. So what sort of things would you set up for me as I'm sort of hanging out in this darker area?
It depends whether it's something you've had planned. So like maybe the players themselves are planning to make use of dark and less seen parts of town to ambush a person of interest or just a person who may have coin. In which case you'd present the map, you'd tell the players what the environment is. So like maybe they're trying to track a merchant down who's got something they need. They find that he frequents a certain tavern. They do their scouting and intel on the place. They're presented this map in advance for going and scouting out. So they know where the tavern room is. They know where the back door is. They found a very nice handy alleyway to the side. So you could then have the players do a couple of different tests. They want to make sure he comes from this direction or has some need to go here. Maybe they need to distract his guards off somehow.
They could obviously use this room here as being something of interest to try and draw him round to this area.
Yeah, and maybe find out that the guards are particularly interested in certain types of drinks, put those on special offer, try and get them a little bit tipsy, and try and get the merchant out by themselves. That's where they'll meet the rogue. The other way around, of course, if it's not the players setting up the encounter, maybe they're just in the theatre of the mind narrative section of a visit to town. They're shopping, they go into the inn things, then suddenly the people that have taken a fancy to their newfound wealth decide to spring an ambush. You'd suddenly, before getting the map out, you sort of say, right, you're at the such and such tavern. What's your character doing? Oh, I found a table in the corner. I want to keep an eye on the whole place.
Well, I suppose
my
maybe
sword's by my side.
Maybe this table here would be the one in the corner and the best one for looking out, because you'd have good view of both the entrances and exits, a nice view of the bar so you can see where the traffic is. And I think if you were sat by a window, you could argue that your party might be a little more exposed, because obviously what's going on outside of the map on this side, again, you can describe that to your players as well.
Yeah, totally. And for that particular instance, once you've got your players telling you where they are, so you're like in the corner, dancing on a table, drinking at the bar, hiding in the darkest corner of a back alley because that's the sort of person they are. That's before you put the map down. And then, once they've told you in just the narrative section what they're doing, then you go, great, here's the map. You place their figures or their counters down, and then it's roll for initiative. The trap has been sprung. They may or may not have spotted it in time, but the trick there is to get your players in a theatre of the mind setting to tell you where they're going to be, and then that dictates the map. And that means that they can't necessarily look at the map and go, right, that's my exact spot. This is where I'll get an advantage in this environment. And then they'll have to move to those spots as soon as the turn order starts coming up. So, if they're high initiative, then they can take cover behind the bar and, avoid the crossbow shots from the people that burst through the back door to try and get them, or whatever it is.
Yeah. And that's a really good point there about using this sort of tactical map alongside theatre of the mind, just to keep the party on their toes and guessing, so they can't plan it out to the nth degree, so that my rogue character won't always go and just hide in the shadows, where obviously that gives me the advantage, or the wizard character won't just stand by the door and pop a fireball straight to it just to be on the safe side, to really make them work for it.
Yeah, there's an interesting flip side to that as well. You can do a psychological game with a battle map. So as soon as you put a battle map down, your players are going to expect some sort of fight, some sort of challenge is going to happen. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you just want them to think it does. So you put a map down, get them to interact on the map for a bit, and then go, right, and take the map away again.
And mess with them.
It may be messing them to a degree. It may just be sort of like setting expectations so that every time there's a map on the table, they're not immediately calculating combat, because maybe it's just there to set the scene and some theme. You're likely to have a space on your table for a map, or if you're doing online play, you're going to be looking at something on the screen anyway, so that could be a map or a splash screen, or just a nice picture to set the mood. You can do the same on the table, just put the map down and sort of go, right, you're in an urban environment, here's an urban map.
Yeah. And obviously in terms of the design of this map, this is really, if I say so myself, Matt, beautifully done, because there is obviously the grid on this map to help planning those tactical encounters and judging distances, but it's actually been worked into the designs, so it's not actually an overlay, which really does help with the immersion on it. Are there any tips that you can give people who want to design something similar?
Yeah, so for D&D style tactical play, the 1-inch grid is king. So 5 foot to 1 inch is what we scale all of our maps to. For these, we've gone with blocks of cobblestones that are drawn so that they're in 1-inch squares, but they are actually unique cobblestones within all those squares.
And you hand draw all those cobblestones?
On a computer, yes.
Yeah.
And same with the larger flagstones here. They've been set so that they are the 1-inch squares. And in the tavern, it's got this nice alternating wooden floor pattern that then neatly makes 1-inch squares. The only sort of place where we've got a full grid overlay is in the dark creases in the carpets. And that's it on this map. So there's different sort of tile design here, which makes it 1-inch squares.
And in terms of the structure, obviously you have, as we talked about at the start, you have this larger tavern area here, or / guild house / hideout for the baddies. We have this larger area with 2 entrances and exits, again, to give options and lots of different scenarios. We also have these narrower areas. So there's narrow area here and narrow here with a couple of open areas. And I'd imagine this is just, again, so that you can accommodate a range of different scenarios and encounters on a map like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same applies to urban wilderness dungeon encounters. You want some set areas where you could have different things happening. So, you've got an individual room here. This one's got some storage in it. Maybe that's full of highly flammable, like moonshine equipment, full of sills and things.
Yeah.
So as soon as, it
does look very suspicious.
Yeah. So, maybe they're selling bootleg liquor all over the place here, and popping through the back and letting off your firebolts turns out was a bad idea.
Mm-hmm. Never a bad idea.
But yeah, just having compartmentalized areas, it restricts movement. It allows you to block line of sight, so you don't know if there's a half dozen enemies hiding in one of these rooms ready to come and run out and assist their friends. So essentially, it just gives you tactical play. So it's not an open field. And obviously, you can customize on top of here with scenery, drawing on it, or anything else to change the layout. Maybe this is, like a private room here, and you just divide it off.
Yeah, it's always handy to have a map which is quite clean, because then you can very easily add in certain features. So if you did want to make this a private area, it's very easy to do so. And in terms of involving the whole party in an encounter, this map is obviously designed to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very common sort of setting, the tavern, or, the social sort of big room. So it could even be a guard barracks or something like that. A guard barracks lucky enough to have its own bar in the corner.
Yeah, there's lucky guards there, although it may come in handy if you can get them to use it too much. Right, so this has been a tavern-based urban map. So I think one of the ones we'll look at next will be an outdoor style map, to have a look at what you can do for an outdoor setting, and maybe get some miniatures out and some additional scenery to show what you can create quite easily.
Excellent.
Right, so for our next encounter scenario, we're going to be using the Frozen Mountain Path map. Obviously, this is an outdoor encounter, and we are going to assume that this one is a little more planned. So maybe in your campaign, you've sent your party here. They need to do something here. And obviously, it's not going to stay as empty as it looks. Matt, did you just want to talk us through this map and let us know some of the key points that you'd use for an encounter?
Yep, so looking at this map, the first sort of things that I'd notice is there's a obvious cave. That's a point of interest. And there's this series of switchbacks leading from what you'd assume is either, probably the bottom down here, and lots of difficult or impassable terrain which make up these height changes. So you've effectively got this long winding route up to a clearer sort of ledge plateau sort of area at the top of this path up the side of a mountainous area. And for this one, obviously, it's a bit more wintry. So whether that's just due to altitude or wherever you are in the game, there's plenty of scope there to have environmental hassles on the player. So slow down movement speed, make them be dressed properly for the cold, or take things like endurance, exhaustion levels.
Now, obviously, if you've planned for an encounter on a map like this, you can plan in some really clever hooks as well. So one thing you could possibly do is, this is using some 3D terrain here, these are by Mantic, is you could, by putting in some dead trees up in this area here, you could possibly suggest that this area hasn't always been a frozen wasteland, and that something may have happened here to create this really challenging environment. So your party could perhaps be here to put that right.
Yeah, and anytime you end up with something odd like that, I suppose the answer is always magic.
A wizard did it.
Essentially, a wizard did it. Or, some sort of an entity from beyond somehow. So that's the sort of thing that gets adventurers going to places. Wizards and extra planar monsters may very well have loot, treasure, and be worth some XP.
Which obviously is a draw to any adventure party. Now, again, on this map, we talked about elevation and there being raised areas here, which of course would mean that you could bring out some flying baddies. And Matt, who are these by these miniatures?
These are Chaosism, and these, I think, actually, no, they're Cthulhu Wars. So, yeah.
It's of course worth mentioning that, I don't know about you, as you probably saw behind us, we have a lot of games, we have a lot of miniatures from loads and loads of different people, and we do tend to use a little bit of everything when we play at home. We have we just find it much easier. I don't know about how your painting regime is here. We are hugely behind, so we tend to go with what we have painted for any given scenario.
Yeah, so with the 1-inch scale, it equates to the same as the 28mm scale that's used in loads of board games, loads of skirmish and war games. So there's lots of being able to mix and match from different places. So lots of things we've got for board games that come with lots of figures, they find use in roleplay situations as well.
Yeah, so I think we have these pillars here from Massive Darkness, so less painting other things. But so you could also suggest that this isn't just a natural environment. There's obviously been some form of man-made activity here, be this a temple or a shrine. It might back up the wizard did it scenario. But again, using terrain like this allows you to really quickly customize a map for lots of different encounters. So this sort of layout could be used over and over again. And I think in terms of map drawing, that is important. You don't want to be drawing lots of very similar varieties of the same mat if you can help it, because obviously that will take a lot of time, and time as a DM is something which is not, you don't have a huge amount of it. So obviously using pre-drawn maps like this one will save huge amounts of time preparing for games and also for random encounters in game, because you can just open something up. But if you wanted to draw and design your own, we would suggest obviously trying to keep it reasonably generic, and then being aware of what other tools and accessories you have as a DM in your house, and being able to use them to customize your map for many different encounters.
Yeah, and that's not to say that, you know, like if you've got an epic set piece that's got a very, very specific sort of map requirement, go ahead and do that specific map. I think something else when we're talking about terrain is one of the good things about putting scattered terrain and things on like this is it can move, it can change, it can interact. So, you know, let's say this is one of our party. They've finally slogged their way up here. These flying creatures have so far been suspiciously still, except when they get to here. Maybe this one flies over. As part of its flight, it clips this. It comes sliding down. That character's got to avoid it, and then it becomes a hazard blocking the path, separate them from, say, their other party members here. And that's when these winged creatures come and try and take their prey. So, you know, having separate pieces on the map means that you can change the environment on the fly as the encounter dictates it. You can do the same with a pen, by all means, just scribble it out and redraw it. But, you know, if you've got bits of 3D scenery like this, or, you know, flat tokens, or the static cling type things, you can move them around on the map and change the environment dynamically as the characters are interacting with it.
Excellent. So that gives you lots of different scenarios you can do as you run your party through these narrow gullies up the path. And so let's say that when you get to this open area here, we're going to be looking, let's be honest, we have a difficult path to negotiate with lots of hazards up towards this cave here, and a suspiciously large open area next to it, which can accommodate larger bases. So the players are obviously going to be expecting a boss fight here when they get to the top. So how would you handle this sort of area?
So if you've given the players all the sort of like the difficulty of getting up there, and one thing this particular map just sort of cries out to me is avalanche. Give the players that extra little bit of difficulty that they've got to do whatever they're doing here silently. And they've got to deal with whatever may or may not come out of that cave silently. You
may, of course, notice that we have a bard in our party here who is now being asked to be silent. So we'll leave it up to you as to how well that recommendation goes with the bard.
Yeah, so I think that's just one of those bits where putting an environmental spin onto a combat counter, or any type of interaction, whether it's a puzzle or whatever else, you know, maybe that puzzle is a giant gong needs to be sounded, but that seems just cruel and unusual. So yeah, once you've got your party up to the top and you've given them a little bit of like bruising and battering, trying to climb through all the thick snow going up the pass, they have a cave. So a good one for a cave, I suppose, is natural monsters. So here we've, well, not that an owlbear's that natural, but
well, yeah, comparatively,
it's part bear, part owl, all monster. So let's say we had that avalanche sort of environmental effect in place. They've now got a creature that the first thing it'll do is come out, roar at them, and they've suddenly got a race against time to get past the owlbear, shelter in the cave before the mountainside comes and tries to wipe them off of it. So, you know, a bit of urgency for the characters. You could make the avalanche happen quicker if they suddenly start, you know, singing loudly and letting off super loud spells and the like.
I mean, so again, it sounds like that what we're using this map as inspiration for is to take environmental factors and use them to change what could be quite a straightforward run-of-the-mill boss encounter to make the party maybe try and use different abilities to what they normally would and approach things in a slightly different way.
Sure, yeah. And for outdoor maps, your characters are going to be traveling. You're not going to have a tactical scale map for miles and miles of journey between locations. So you're going to only want to get the tactical maps out when it's time for a challenge. So you could do this map with no monsters on at all. And just, as a DM, you've decided where the points are, where they need to make skill checks, where they need to go through deep snow. If that avalanche is a problem, maybe it's a blizzard and you roll every so often to see if they accidentally go off the side of the mountain. So this could be a challenge map.
So by the time they've worked their way up to the top hill, they're going to be tired. So again, we have some scatter terrain here from Mantic, so they could create a nice little winter camp, assuming they bought their thermals, because it is going to be cold.
Yep. And that's another classic one for having an outdoor map, is you go to the tactical map when something's happening when you're traveling. So whether it's random encounters or pre-planned. But the other classic, of course, is camping. So even if you're not going to have an overnight encounter for your party, it can be fun to have just a suitable setting. So, they're in the mountains, so we've used this map. If they're on the grass plains, we'd use a grass map, in the forest, a forest map, etc. And just have them, place down markers for their bedrolls, their tents and things. And nothing makes players any more nervous than asking them for who's doing which watch and how they've set up their camp on a map. They will immediately be expecting that they're going to be attacked in some way. And they might be right. I mean, other things you can do as well is you can flip this idea of a straight top-down map with ones like this. You could actually say this is a sheer cliff face. And, if you maybe lie your figures down and then they are climbing up and trying to get to the top of the cliff face. So, using a map in a slightly different way to just straight down 5-foot tactical combat. And then you could have monsters that, either fly or are good at climbing. So, like one where PCs are climbing up and lots of frost spiders who are super fast and nimble across the whole thing are attacking them.
That would be a very interesting sort of vertical scenario, which of course often we do think top down as being the definitive way to do it, but introducing that change of perspective could be really interesting. Yeah,
and the same thing works for things like underwater or flying or similar things like that. I mean, for this one, you could then also get your pen out and mark where they're pittoning and where the ropes are, and that could give them an advantage on climbing checks if they've got the climbing gear in place. And if they're all roped together and they come off, you could see one drag the other down and, give them a physical representation of a physical challenge in a game as opposed to just combat. I mean, the same thing you could do for things like, let's say that for whatever reason this snow is more dangerous, maybe radioactive snow or whatever it is, or maybe it's a frozen piece of river or something, and they've got to jump between the gaps and not touch the snow. I mean, that sort of thing works well on things like lava maps, water maps, things where there's a definite environmental hazard implied by the terrain.
Yeah, and it's about how, I suppose, if you are drawing and designing a map, you make sure that you include as much of that as possible so that you can give your party lots of different challenges which they might not normally encounter.
Yeah, you want someone to look at a map and think, how would I negotiate this map to achieve my goal?
Excellent. Right. I think up next we're going to do a dungeon.
Everyone loves a dungeon.
Everyone loves a dungeon. Right, so you're in a dark room. This is a dungeon map. And obviously when you're adventuring through a dungeon, lots of different things can happen. Now, for this scenario, that we have assumed that you, as the Dungeon or Game Master, have planned this encounter. This is a set piece, so there's lots and lots and lots going on this map. We're going to be using scatter terrain, and we're going to have a look at the map itself and see how it's designed and go through some tips on how you can adventure through it. So what we have here is a really large, this is a 2 foot by 2 foot dungeon with lots of rooms of various sizes, up from the big, suspiciously large rooms with lots going on, right through to your really small storerooms. We've got lots of mantic scatter terrain on this map. So the first thing I notice is we've got lots of doors. We've also got lots of furniture. And with any sort of scatter terrain like this, it just adds a bit of a hook for each room as to what you could possibly expect to find. So Matt, take us through this map. There is a lot going on.
Okay, so this is a good session or multiple sessions worth of content, I'd say, depending on how things go for your party. And just looking at this one without having really sort of pre-planned it ourselves, let's take a look. This is obviously a big focal point. We've got I think it's an old Games Workshop arcane ruin pillar there. And lots of small rooms around that central room. So with dungeons, you kind of want to make sure there's a reason potentially for visiting different areas of it, as well as having a bit of a story and plot behind it. So this seems to be some sort of like focal point of power, something like that. So the PCs are going to be interested in interacting with that in some way. We've got things like this arcane orrery there, a well, some storage, some bookcases and the like, some weapon storage. So, and a throne. So it's likely that there are denizens here. There are people that call this dungeon home and operate and work here in some way. So, you know, dungeons aren't necessarily just a collection of 20 random rooms with different creatures in that pop out when you open the door. They can be, by all means, but a dungeon is a location. It should have some coherency to it that lends itself to some plot and a reason for being there, etc. I think as well, having reasons to visit other areas. So, you know, if this is their target and they're coming in, we've got the party coming in from this sort of area here, they could end up just walking straight in. They've got to that room, they collect the gubbin, they leave.
So the quickest route would be simply here. And as you can see, this really uses only a tiny, tiny portion of the map.
Yeah. So you can either decide that that's not going to be an option for them and just insert a wall there or anywhere else so that this is a distinct section, this is a distinct section, this is, and this is, so that then the path becomes much more all the way around the dungeon. So it'll be all up around the top section here and then back down, which obviously, I mean, I suppose as a DM and a map drawer, you want to use as much of this map as possible. Oh, yeah, yeah. And if you've planned this to be like a couple of sessions worth of content, going straight point A, point B.
So you could, again, going back to those environmental factors, just because you're indoors doesn't mean that the environment you're in can upside. So you could obviously get one of your pillars from earlier and block off the easy way. So then they have to go around, but they might not know it's blocked off until they've worked their way around this corner here. So it might be quite a frustrating path around for them.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's one thing we've not really mentioned before is fog of war. You might want to use for dungeon maps, so you like not let the players know what's coming up. It doesn't lend itself quite as well when you've got scenery here, but in theory you could get just blank sheets of paper and just place them in the areas they've not seen yet.
And of course, the wonderful thing with using 3D scatter terrain on a pre-printed map is that it's very quick and easy to set up. So in theory, you could only have this area visible as they come in, and then only as they work their way around do you reveal the map and quickly populate it with what you want, because it's the work of moments to just quickly set this up, and that's what they're looking at then.
Yeah, so we could, for example, sort of like have just the doors laid out, not the terrain inside the rooms, wait until they open the said door, then they find out there's a well in there.
So obviously we're using a lot of mantic scatter terrain for this map. Other 3D terrain is available, and we indeed ourselves, we do some other options to help you customize maps as well. So there's lots and lots out there on the market, so this makes it very easy and achievable to do.
Yep, so plot-wise and things here, let's have that blocked, and then let's give the PC some reason to visit some of these other rooms. So, you know, maybe they need a couple of artifacts that will then insert themselves into there or help solve some sort of riddle on that pillar, unlocking some sort of treasure there. In fact, I'm going to move this throne, pop it there.
Which I think should be just in shot up here past the meadow. This is obviously the large area. And again, what this map features is larger areas smaller confined areas and lots of broken lines of sight. So I'll imagine that as a DM, when you're planning your encounter on a map like this, you will try and use all these factors to try and bring the party out of their usual pattern.
Yeah, so if we're saying there's people that live here and like treat it as their own home base, I think we've got some orcs sat around.
We do. Shall we populate the orcs?
Yep, so we're not going to populate them everywhere because the PCs will only know where they are when they're in sight. So what we'll do is we'll put some nice and close to the entrance here. These are probably the ones guarding the door.
And these are beautiful little miniatures, Matt. Who are these by?
These are savage orcs. These are old Citadel orcs, I believe. And these would have been painted at some point in the 90s.
Which is actually the last time we had chance to paint miniatures, funnily enough. Right, so there we go. We have some orcs on the map.
So we've put one of our little books just to the side here to basically put a staging area in. So we've got a party of 5 here, dwarf and a fighter. What we've got here, this is a Reaper mini. That's a Zombicide Black Plague mini, and then some WizKids minis.
So once again, what we've done for this encounter is what we do for all our games is we've harvested everything we have to hand and used it for whatever purpose we need it to be.
Yep. And on that particular note, we've got a nice big double door here. Let's say this is the only one we happen to have as terrain. So the party open up this door and we decided actually this room over here has a double door.
So we're just going to quickly whip it over there. But then the party can't see that, so that's absolutely okay. Yep. Right, so we are entering the dungeon.
So obviously we've got corridors that are set as 10 foot wide, which is nice and generous for a dungeon corridor.
Yeah.
But I tend to find if you're designing a map and you use too many just 5 foot wide corridors, you end up with essentially just a conga line of characters. And, yes, you can say they can move through each other's space and things, but it gets tricky because each miniature obviously takes up 1 square. So only ever one person can fight at the front line. There's less space for manoeuvring and moving around. Like you want to be able to sort of like have that fighter occupied, and then maybe someone can get through and try and get his friends, or both fighters have to hold the front ground. Your bard gives some inspiration at the back. Your wizard's there throwing his spells around, and that looks like it's probably a paladin or something. Is they're ready for frontline action and just generally sort of buffing and helping their friends.
I think that's not to say this, but I mean, we obviously feature this 10-foot corridor for all the reasons that Matt has just described. But I think it's important to say that if you are going to run an encounter with all 10-foot corridors, then you can, by all means, use some of the environmental factors to create some pinch points. So you could have a collapsed door there, which for some reason is creating a slight blockage in the corridor. And this would be an interesting pinch point to work around because it could obviously afford some of the baddies behind it some cover.
Yeah, and I think we've got a barricade here that would do nicely for blocking a section of corridor off, especially with these archers and things.
So again, you can use ideas like this just to help break up what I think we as players, and that as a DM, you must have been in that scenario where it's another dungeon encounter. You've got to go through another corridor to get to another room, and it's something that we've all done before. So how can you keep it fresh?
So it doesn't necessarily need to be a combat slog every step of the way. So I think start by letting the players do some scouting, starting, before they even get to the location. Can they get information on it? Do they know the habits of, who lives there and, what might be there? Do your intel work. So, whether that's your scholarly characters researching, the ancient place, potentially let them find a different way in. Maybe there's a crawl space through a crack in one of the sort of mountainside walls that means them, they've got to sort of shuffle on their bellies and things, but they end up popping out of, let's say that drain there.
So yes, this could obviously link into anything. It could be a sewer, it could be a cave system. There's lots of interesting things you can do for sneaking in. And I think that's really important, again, for giving them more than one option. You don't necessarily want it to be a dungeon crawl every single time. Maybe it's a slightly different spin on it. Yeah,
absolutely. And, maybe the approach is subtle. Maybe they find out this is controlled by these orcs and they find something these orcs want and they negotiate. And you roleplay it through. You may not even need to come to a battle map. But obviously it's going to take a turn and go wrong at some point, and then you end up with your orcish Mexican standoff at some point where they take what you've brought them and then decide that they want everything you've got as well. They've set you up for a trap. Maybe they've taken you into one of the rooms to wait. The door's locked. They start pumping in poison gas.
Which would then move us into a more combat-focused scenario. So let's go ahead and move our party into the dungeon a little bit. So
they've come in. They've maybe dealt with one or two guards around the door. Hopefully silently. You might do some sort of alarm mechanic. So maybe there's a bunch of the guys in these couple of rooms here. You do some checks for them. Have they passed their perception? Do they know that something's happened in this corridor? And then, you can have your players hear an approach. So, do they just stand and fight? Do they charge forward? Do they hook around the corner, try and draw the guards off further away from where they might get reinforcements? Do they want to try and set the scene to make it look like something else happened? Those 4 guards had an argument and killed each other. Maybe. Adding some different conflict between the residents in a dungeon is possibly also a good idea. So, I think we've got an owlbear still sat around from our mountain pass.
Here he is.
So maybe they keep an owlbear chained up in a room down here. Maybe that owlbear doesn't like...
move him up here so he's a bit more visible.
Oh, yep. So owlbear lives in that room there. The owlbear hates the orcs. They prod and poke him whenever they get a chance. He would very much like to get back at them. And maybe the PCs have heard this. Maybe they find some clues in the dungeon itself that tell them this. Interrogate a guard, that sort of thing. And, put things in the environment that the characters can interact with in different ways to gain an advantage or solve the problems the dungeon presents them in different ways. I mean, classic things are traps. So, maybe there's an area which looks like it's never been trodden on. Maybe you choose some of these brighter tiles on this section here. And maybe they're nice and bright because no one ever sort of dirties them with their feet and things, and that's because they set off traps.
I've just coloured them in here so you can see it clearly on the map. But yes, as you can see, based on the design underneath, these tiles do look suspiciously new and untrodden on. And again, that's another environmental factor that you can maybe bring into your encounters. Yeah,
and I suppose back to map drawing tips is if you're doing things like dungeons, just vary the shade in your colour palette in places. Otherwise, it can get very, very sameish if it's all exactly the same shade of grey.
Yeah, I mean, you can probably see by this map, you can tell that we are big fans of Hero Quest, which I think comes across in our design here. But we've used different colours to break up the look of the dungeon, but they could also be associated with the different environmental factors in each of the rooms. So this could be maybe a cold, wet room. It could be the ice storage. It could have some leaks. If you're subterranean, you're going to have some water ingress in certain places. So you can use maybe these bluer themed tiles that are in the floor here to present as puddles or wet areas that can have their own challenges associated with them. And this green room again maybe has some plant ingress into it, some ivy, which may or may not be slightly more suspicious than the average ivy you'd expect to find. So again, there's lots of different aspects you can bring into encounters simply by varying your colour palette.
Yeah, so I mean, that example with the room which may or may not have some sentient entangling plant life in it. Maybe that's generally avoided by the local populace, and they use it for keeping prisoners and things in. But if you can trick the enemy into searching for it, throw something interesting looking there, make a noise, run away, try and drag them in, and give your players a chance to outthink and outmaneuver the monsters as opposed to just necessarily outroll them in a fight.
I think that's another important point, because obviously in any party you're going to have a range of skills and abilities, some of which might not be as focused towards combat as others. So again, it's important to make sure that your entire party feels involved in any encounter. And it's not just a case of stand behind the tank and wait for the inevitable to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if your party's got their plans and their tactics down exactly how they want them. They have their tank in place. They've got like a support character. They've got like like the wizard to do a certain set of spells in a certain order. Don't let them always get away with having exactly the same game plan. Throw them curveballs. So like whether that's suddenly the lights go out and like the tanks can't see where they are and the players get mixed up in the order a bit, then a great flash of light comes back and suddenly they're having to deal with a situation not in their perfect formation. Splitting them up on a map like this can work because you can still see where everyone is and you don't necessarily need to deal with the characters individually.
I mean, again, because you have two paths to get to what would be your goal point, if you were to block off the party here, then immediately you've got a scenario where these people are probably going to have the harder way around, whereas you have here, and of course, if you have things like your owlbear in the encounter here, this could be a very interesting scenario, which works up quite quickly and easily. The other thing, of course, you'll notice is that we're using doors on this map. And Matt, what can you say about doors and the fun you can have with doors on any map?
They come down to like a classic movable piece of terrain. So you could, as I think we said earlier, not have anything in any of these rooms. Open the door, find out what's in there.
Yes, so only populate a room after you open the door.
And I think you can have all manner of different doors as far as like what type of door it is, whether there's any sort of like a specialities needed to get through it. So essentially a door could just be a piece of cloth hanging off of a bit of rope, covering the doorway, blocks line of sight, doesn't really do much else. All the way up to like a complex magical doors with talking faces and solve my riddle to get in, that sort of thing. So what they mainly give you is control over the area. So you can say which rooms are accessible, which aren't, block the path of combatants, and split parties up, split monster groups up, or wait until the last moment, open them really quickly, and use them as a weapon.
And again, it's worth saying again that we're using Mantic scatter terrain on this map to demonstrate all this. But simply, if you don't have this to hand, you can use something as simple as a whiteboard marker on a laminated white queen map, and you can then close and remove doors very easily at your leisure. And something as simple as that will really have quite an impact on awareness of what's in the room, how the party might react and act in any sort of scenario. So something as simple as a door can be a very useful tool for a DM.
Yeah, I think talking about monsters and the enemy essentially in a dungeon is make them not necessarily intelligent, but make them living, thinking things. So, entering this environment at different times may have them in different places. They've got to sleep sometime. They would have routines and things. So, like moving between areas, whether that be just simply going between rooms, patrols, meal times. Put a little bit of real life routine into it and it'll feel more like a living place. That's not necessarily going to be true all the time. This could be full of ghosts and skeletons, but them having an echo of their previous life can give a feel to the dungeon as well.
Yeah, and again, we're working with a physical map and assets here, but this would be equally available to you if you played online, a scenario like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like fog of war and having miniatures sort of visible and not visible works very well online because it lends itself to that. You can also do things like dynamic lighting. So you'll have your tokens set up and your walls arranged so that the light changes depending on who moves where. And if you've said, this character emits a light source, as in they've got a torch or a lantern or something, or not.
Right. So just in summary then, we spent a lot of time talking about this fantastically in-depth dungeon scenario we've got here. If you as a DM, you want to draw a dungeon map for more of a set piece encounter, so the party are going to go here and spend some time here and you want to make it nice, involved and interesting, what would be your top tips for that?
So if you've got your encounter laid out, so you know what you're wanting to throw at your party potentially. So like quite often there's the whole 5-room dungeon principle. So like you have an entrance, then some sort of challenge, then like a choice or a different type of challenge, Then you have your boss encounter, and then a bit of a twist or a turn at the end to make it a bit more interesting and memorable. So know what your area is going to be. So you're going to have some sort of entrance, whether that's a doorway, you're teleporting in, drop through a trapdoor, and suddenly now you're in the dungeon. You've entered a maze of death competition. You go through the entrance. So however you start the scene off, you need to know what that is. And then you need to be able to progress from there to your first encounter, or get the players to choose between some encounters. And quite often you'd want to theme these things. So, the entrance should give a taste of what the dungeon's going to be like. If this is full of orcs and things, then maybe it's got loads of war banners up all over the place. And, if people can read the language of the inhabitants, basically tell them to go away, or, they're not welcome, etc. So start flavouring things there, give some hints, some clues, and carry that throughout. Then I like personally to have more than one route or option, or more than one way of doing the route if there's only one route in, or one route through the encounters. So if you're drawing it up, you kind of... first thing, know what amount of space you've got.
Yeah, because also in terms of your table, because this is 2 foot by 2 foot, and we're fortunate enough to have a large table. But when we're playing, you've got character sheets, you've got snacks, you've got dice towers, all your miniatures. It can take a lot of space. Not everybody has a large space, so a dungeon doesn't have to be a massive expanse. You can just have a smaller map and then work through it sequentially. Yeah. Using that as almost like as a fog of war idea. And I think use of colour in a dungeon as well. If you're drawing this from scratch, don't be afraid to use a bit of colour. And obviously, again, using light sources and shadowed areas can also add another dimension to your map as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think, if you're doing a planned dungeon, know what your end encounter is going to be, like whether that's a big room, a set of interconnected rooms or chambers or whatever. Make sure you've got space for that. Know where the entrance is, and then put some bits in between when they get in and to where they finish. And make sure that there's ways to maneuver between them. So corridors between areas, things like chasms in the ground are always a good one. Making sure there's some physical or intellectual challenges to go alongside just combat.
I think that is a very important tip, because it again involves all your party and might break them out of their preferred encounter habits, as it were. Right, I think that brings us to the end of talking about our dungeon map. So fantastic. We'll see you back in a second. Right, so that brings us to the end of our section talking about encounter maps and some top DM tips for running encounters. We hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. Once again, I'm Tam.
I'm Matt.
And we are Loke Battlemats. You can find our map books in your local gaming store and from your favourite online retailer, of course, on our website as well, www.lokebattlemats.com. We've been using a lot of our own books, so this is The Dungeon. We've also used the Giant Book of Battlemats Volume 2, and huge thanks to Mantic and WizKids Games Workshop and everybody else's wonderful products we've been using to demonstrate our encounters. And thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you all very much.
And goodbye. Thank
Bye.
you.